Right now, somewhere, rain is hammering a window. Someone is stuck inside. They've refreshed their phone for the 11th time. They've made a cup of coffee they didn't need. 3 days of gray sky, and they're already climbing the walls. Annoying, right? But the truth about what happens to a human brain trapped by weather is far stranger than annoying. Because your ancestors didn't get 3 days of rain. Some of them got 7. No phone, no electricity, no forecast telling them when the sky would clear. Just wind and water, and the mouth of a cave filled with the same flat gray light, day after day after day. So what did they actually do in there? Picture it. You're somewhere in what is now southern France or northern Spain, tens of thousands of years ago. The storm rolled in on the second day of a hunting trip, and it hasn't stopped since. The river that was ankle deep is now a brown, churning wall of water. The animals you were tracking have vanished, scattered into whatever shelter they could find. Your fire pit is the only warm thing for miles. There's no waiting it out on a couch. A week-long storm in the Pleistocene wasn't background noise. It was a full stop on almost everything that kept you alive. Hunting stopped because you can't track prey through sheets of rain and you can't see a spear land in a downpour. Foraging stopped because the plants you knew were buried under mud or washed away entirely. Moving camp stopped because rivers you'd normally cross on foot had turned into something that could sweep away a grown adult in seconds. And the danger didn't stop at hunger. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin. A body that's cold, tired, and low on food doesn't just feel miserable. It starts making mistakes. Slower reflexes. Foggier judgment. A single infected cut in those conditions could be a death sentence weeks later. Every single person in that shelter knew, on some level, that staying alive for the next 7 days wasn't guaranteed. It depended entirely on the group functioning as one unit instead of 30 separate individuals waiting to be told what to do. The air inside that shelter would have been thick, wet fur drying too slowly, smoke that couldn't quite escape fast enough, curling along the ceiling before finding its way out through a gap in the rock, children coughing, someone's stomach growling, loudly enough that everyone pretends not to hear it. Outside, the rain never fully stops being the loudest sound in the world. So, everyone stayed. Everyone waited. For 7 days, a group of maybe 15 to 30 people sat inside a rock shelter with nothing to do but keep a fire alive and keep each other alive. That second part matters more than it sounds like it should. Fire wasn't just warmth. The primatologist Richard Wrangham has spent much of his career arguing that control of fire reshaped the human body and the human day. Cooked food meant smaller guts and more energy for a growing brain. But fire also created something else entirely. A fixed point in the dark that a group had to gather around, night after night, whether they wanted to or not. During an ordinary week, that gathering happened for a few hours after the sun went down. During a storm, when there was nowhere to go and nothing to hunt, that gathering could stretch across an entire day, an entire week. Archaeologists digging through European rock shelters have found exactly this pattern written into the ground itself. Layer after layer of ash and charcoal, stacked on top of each other in the same few square meters. Hearth rebuilt on hearth. Generation after generation choosing the same spot to sit. That's not an accident of geography. That's a group returning, again and again, to the one place built for waiting. What do you think 15 people do, crammed into a rock shelter, staring at the same fire, for 168 hours straight? They talk. The anthropologist Polly Weissner spent years recording conversations among the Juhoansi, a hunter-gatherer people in southern Africa, and she noticed something that should sound familiar. During the day, conversation was practical. Complaints, negotiations, arguments about who owed who. A share of meat. But once the sun went down and everyone settled around the fire, the subject changed completely. Daytime talk was about logistics. Firelight talk was about stories, myths, memories of people who had died, jokes about people who were still very much alive. Weissner's research suggests this nightly shift wasn't random. It was doing something. Firelight conversations strengthened social bonds across a whole community, and it passed cultural knowledge from the old to the young in a form people actually wanted to sit still and listen to. Now stretch that single evening into 7 straight days. A storm didn't just trap your ancestors physically, it trapped them socially. And that's a very different kind of pressure. There was no excuse to wander off to your own tasks. No hunt to plan for tomorrow, because tomorrow looked exactly like today. Just a fire and a circle of faces, and an enormous, uncomfortable stretch of time that had to be filled with something. Put that many people that close together for that long, and friction is inevitable. The psychologist Peter Sudfeld built much of his career studying exactly this problem in modern isolated groups, from polar research stations to submarine crews. Small teams sealed away from the outside world for weeks at a time don't just battle boredom, they battle each other. Petty irritations get amplified. Old grudges resurface with nowhere to burn off. Sudfeld's research found that the groups who came through confinement the healthiest weren't the ones who avoided each other. They were the ones who built shared rituals, humor, and structure into the downtime itself. A storm-bound rock shelter 30,000 years ago had exactly the same problem, and almost certainly the same solution. A fire to sit around, a rule about who spoke when. A story everyone already knew, retold anyway, because the retelling itself was the point. Talking wasn't the only thing filling that week. The evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has studied another behavior that shows up in exactly this kind of setting: synchronized rhythm. Singing together, chanting together, tapping out a beat on stone or hide in time with everyone else in the group. Dunbar's work found that this kind of shared rhythm triggers a real physical response, a flood of endorphins that produces the same kind of bonding effect as one-on-one grooming, except it works on an entire group at once. A week trapped by a storm is precisely the setting where that behavior would have paid off the most. You can't groom 30 people one at a time. You can sing with all 30 at once. Here's the part that gets stranger. That discomfort might be exactly the point. The paleoanthropologist Rick Potts has spent decades studying how ancient climates shaped human evolution, and he built an entire theory around this kind of unpredictability. He calls it the variability selection hypothesis. The idea is simple, but it changes how you think about your ancestors completely. Potts argues that early humans didn't evolve to master one specific environment. They evolved to survive constant, violent swings between environments. Wet years followed by drought. Warm centuries followed by cold snaps. Calm seasons followed by storm systems that could pin a group down for days with no warning at all. According to this idea, it wasn't stability that built the human brain. It was instability. A species that could never assume tomorrow would look like today needed something no other animal on the savannah had: the ability to improvise, to plan for problems that hadn't happened yet, to hold on to information that might only matter once in a generation. A 7-day storm is instability in its purest form. What do you do with a week you never asked for? Your ancestors didn't just survive it. They used it. Because sitting still for a week isn't actually sitting still, not for a human brain. Someone in that shelter is running a hand over a cracked spear shaft, slowly reshaping the wood, because there's finally time to fix the thing they'd been meaning to fix for a month. Someone else is rebraiding cordage, or scraping a hide, or teaching a child how to nap a stone tool properly for the first time, because for once, nobody's rushing anywhere. An older member of the group is telling the story of the last flood that nearly killed everyone, describing exactly which ridge stayed dry and which valley became a death trap, because that memory might be the only thing that saves this exact group of people the next time the water rises. A storm was the closest thing the Pleistocene had to a classroom. On an ordinary day, a child learning to nap stone or start a fire got a rushed lesson between chores, squeezed in around everything else that had to get done. On a storm day, there was nothing else that had to get done. An adult could sit with a child for hours, correcting the angle of a strike, letting them fail and try again, telling them the same story about the flood 3 separate times until the child could recite it back word for word. That's not a coincidence either. That's the single best teaching environment a Stone Age child was ever going to get, and the weather built it for free. Does any of that look like survival? Not at first. It looks like idle chatter and repair work, and the kind of aimless mental wandering you'd apologize for today. But it was rehearsal. It was maintenance. It was information moving from the people who had it to the people who needed it, wrapped in a story specifically because a story is what a bored brain, held completely still, actually wants to listen to. And that kind of story can last an unbelievably long time. The geographer Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nicholas Reed studied Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, describing coastlines that no longer exist, coastlines that were swallowed by rising seas more than 7,000 years ago. The details in those stories matched the geological record almost exactly. Names of places that are now underwater. Descriptions of land bridges that vanished as the ocean rose. That kind of accuracy doesn't survive 7,000 years by accident. It survives because a culture kept retelling it. generation after generation, in exactly the kind of setting where nobody had anywhere else to be. A flood myth isn't just a myth. Sometimes it's a 7,000-year-old weather report, kept alive by people with nothing to do but talk. There's a modern echo of this that researchers have only recently started to take seriously. The psychologist Sandy Mann, at the University of Central Lancashire, ran a series of experiments in which she deliberately bored people, giving them dull, repetitive tasks with nothing to distract them. Afterward, those bored participants performed better on creative problem-solving tasks than people who hadn't been bored at all. Her conclusion was almost embarrassingly simple. A mind with nothing external to react to doesn't shut down. It turns inward and starts generating its own material instead. Daydreams, associations, new combinations of old information. Sound familiar? That's the same mechanism, running on a much smaller scale inside your skull right now. Which brings it back to that window, and that rain, and that itch you feel to check your phone for the 12th time. That restlessness isn't a flaw. It's an ancient signal, one that used to mean something very specific. Nothing external to do, so it's time to generate something internal instead. Your ancestors answered that signal with fire and faces and stories that carried real survival information disguised as entertainment. You usually answer it by opening an app that gives you 1,000 tiny hits of somebody else's story instead of building your own. Same circuit, very different fuel. Think about the last time the power actually went out at your place. No screen, no Wi-Fi, just you and whoever else was in the room, and a candle if you were lucky. For a few minutes, it's uncomfortable. And then, more often than not, somebody starts telling a story, an old memory, an embarrassing one, something that happened to their grandmother, or something that happened to them last year. They never quite got around to mentioning. It happens almost automatically, like the brain has been waiting for permission to do it. It has. That permission used to come from the weather. Notice how people talk about camping trips, or cabins with no signal, or that one holiday where the Wi-Fi router broke and never got fixed. They almost always describe it the same way, annoying for the first hour. Then, somehow, one of the best weekends they've had in years. Nobody planned for that. It happens because the same ancient mechanism kicks in the moment the external noise disappears. A room full of people, with nowhere else to look, eventually starts looking at each other instead. On the 7th morning, the sound changes. Not all at once. The rain thins out, drop by drop, until the roar that's been sitting on top of everyone's skull for a week finally lifts. Someone notices it first and goes quiet. Then everyone goes quiet, listening to the silence the way you'd listen to music. Eventually, somebody steps out to the mouth of the shelter and just stands there, letting actual daylight hit their face for the first time in what feels like a month. The world outside is a mess. Flattened grass, fallen branches, a river still too swollen to cross safely. And yet nobody walks back into that shelter the same person who walked in 7 days earlier. Tools are sharper. A few new songs exist that didn't exist a week ago. A child knows how to nap a blade edge that they couldn't manage before. And every single person in that group knows a version of the flood story now, word for word, ready to tell it themselves the next time somebody needs to hear it. 7 days of storm didn't just test whether a group of ancient humans could stay warm and fed. It tested whether they could stay a group at all, packed into one space with nothing but each other's company and no way out. The ones who came out the other side with stronger bonds, better repaired tools, and a fresh set of stories carrying real, useful knowledge were the ones better equipped for whatever came next. Multiply that across thousands of generations and thousands of storms, and you're not looking at wasted time anymore. You're looking at one of the quiet engines that built the human mind. So the next time rain hammers your window and the boredom starts creeping in, and your hand drifts toward your phone out of pure habit, catch yourself for a second. You're not fighting off nothing. You're feeling the exact same ancient pressure that once sat a species down around a fire for a week at a time and, very slowly, without anyone planning it, turned that boredom into the beginning of everything you'd call human.